You're under arrest. Hands behind your back. Don't resist. It's over.
I'm not resisting. You have the wrong man. Save it. You're coming with me.
This is a mistake. Walk, now.
A quiet morning in an exclusive Maryland suburb shattered when an aggressive police officer spotted a black man simply checking his mail. Assuming the worst, the officer ignored every warning sign, slapped on the cuffs, and dragged his target to the precinct, hungry for a major bust. But he had not arrested a burglar. He had arrested the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Soon the local station would be surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. Karma rarely hits this hard. The sun hung low over the manicured lawns of Bethesda, Maryland, casting long, peaceful shadows across the affluent neighborhood of Elmwood Estates. It was the kind of place where the silence was broken only by the soft ticking of underground sprinkler systems and the occasional hum of a luxury sedan. Cedric Ashford cherished these rare, quiet mornings. As director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his life was a relentless storm of national security briefings, congressional hearings, and crisis management. But in these private moments, before his secure phone inevitably began to buzz, he was just a homeowner tending to his hydrangeas. Cedric was dressed for comfort, wearing faded gray sweatpants, worn-out sneakers, and a vintage Georgetown University sweatshirt that had seen better decades. He still carried the broad-shouldered, imposing build of his early days as a field agent, though his hair had turned completely silver. He held a green garden hose, letting cool water soak into the soil of his prize-winning flower beds, utterly at peace. Down the winding suburban street, a local police cruiser crawled along the asphalt. Behind the wheel was Officer Wade Mercer. Mercer was a man whose ambition far exceeded his actual law enforcement ability. He had a reputation in the precinct for being overly aggressive, always fishing for the kind of high-profile arrest that might fast-track him to detective. Riding beside him was his partner, Officer Nolan Briggs, a quieter, older man who mostly kept his head down and waited for retirement. "Look at this place," Mercer muttered, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel as they cruised past sprawling stone mansions. "People out here have more money than they know what to do with. Makes them easy targets." "Crime rate here is practically zero, Wade," Briggs replied softly, taking a sip from his insulated coffee mug. "Only thing we ever get called out here for is a noise complaint about a pool pump." "Yeah, well, you still have to keep your eyes open. Complacency gets you killed," Mercer recited, though the dramatic sentiment barely fit the serene suburban setting. As the cruiser rounded the bend, Mercer narrowed his eyes. He spotted a figure at the end of a long paved driveway. Cedric stood beside the flower beds in his baggy sweats, reaching into the oversized brick mailbox. Mercer tapped the brakes. The cruiser slowed to a crawl. He stared at Cedric, a tall black man in old clothes standing in front of a multi-million-dollar property, and the gears in his biased, eager mind began to turn. "What do we have here?" Mercer murmured, pulling the cruiser toward the curb and putting it in park. Briggs sighed, looking up from his coffee. "Wait, leave it alone. The guy's just getting the paper. That is the Ashford residence." Mercer scoffed. He knew the house belonged to someone important, though he had never bothered to learn the face of the man who owned it. "He looks like a drifter casing the place, or maybe a disgruntled landscaper. I am going to check it out." Before Briggs could protest further, Mercer was already out of the cruiser, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. He adjusted his sunglasses and strutted up the driveway, his boots crunching loudly against the pristine concrete. Cedric heard the heavy footsteps and turned, shutting the mailbox door. He held the thick paper under his arm and offered a polite, neighborly nod, completely unbothered by the police presence. "Good morning, officer." "Step away from the mailbox," Mercer commanded, his voice sharp and stripped of basic courtesy. Cedric raised one silver eyebrow. His polite smile faded into a look of calm, calculated assessment. Over his long career in federal law enforcement, he had encountered every type of human behavior. He instantly recognized the puffed-out chest, the aggressive posture, and the hard stare. It was the universal body language of an insecure officer looking for a confrontation. "I live here," Cedric said simply, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that naturally commanded a room. "I'm just getting my paper." "I said step away from the box and keep your hands where I can see them," Mercer barked, stepping closer. "Do you have identification on you?" I do not carry my wallet when I step outside to water my lawn, Cedric replied, his tone still perfectly level. My ID is inside the house. Give me a moment and I can retrieve it. You are not going anywhere, Mercer snapped, closing the distance between them. Whose house is this? What is the homeowner's name? Cedric sighed quietly. The homeowner's name is Cedric Ashford. As I just told you, that is me. Mercer let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. Right, sure it is. You own this place? A guy dressed like you? I know people who live in this neighborhood, pal. You do not fit the profile. The profile? Cedric repeated. The phrase hung in the humid air. Cedric's eyes turned cold, though his posture remained entirely relaxed. Officer, I strongly suggest you reconsider this line of inquiry. You are making an assumption based on a profound lack of information. Check the plates on the SUV in the garage. Call your dispatcher. Do not tell me how to do my job, Mercer growled, offended that the man he had already decided was a suspect was now giving him instructions. He reached out and grabbed Cedric's right arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back. Cedric's muscles tensed instinctively, but his disciplined mind overrode his reflexes. He knew better than to physically resist a local patrolman, especially an erratic one. He let his arm be pulled behind him, the paper dropping onto the driveway. Officer Briggs jogged up the driveway, looking panicked. Wade, hey, let us take a second here. He is not fighting you. He is refusing to identify himself and trespassing on private property, Mercer said, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. The heavy metal clicked loudly as he locked them tight around Cedric's thick wrists. Too tight. Cedric stood perfectly still, his hands bound behind his back. He looked directly into Mercer's eyes, his expression completely devoid of fear. Officer, Cedric said softly, his voice carrying the chilling weight of absolute authority, I will not resist you, but I'm going to tell you exactly once. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Take these cuffs off now, and we can pretend this never happened. Mercer smirked and shoved Cedric toward the cruiser. Save it for the judge, buddy. You are under arrest. The back seat of the Bethesda local police cruiser was made of hard, molded plastic, designed for easy cleaning rather than comfort. Cedric sat rigidly, his broad shoulders forced forward by the tight steel biting into his wrists. The car smelled faintly of stale fast food and cheap, industrial disinfectant. Through the plexiglass divider, he stared at the back of Officer Mercer's head, analyzing the situation with the icy detachment that had made him a legendary federal investigator. He was not angry. Anger was useless in a crisis. Instead, Cedric felt a profound, almost clinical disappointment. He had dedicated his life to reforming law enforcement and raising the standards of policing across the nation. Yet here he was, detained by an arrogant local officer acting entirely on unchecked prejudice. Cedric mentally logged every procedural violation Mercer had committed. No probable cause, no Miranda warning, excessive force, failure to verify identity before detention. In the driver's seat, Mercer practically glowed with self-satisfaction. He tapped the steering wheel to the rhythm of the radio, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at his prisoner. See, Briggs, Mercer boasted, speaking loudly enough for Cedric to hear. This is how you keep a neighborhood clean. Proactive policing. Guy could not even keep his story straight. Said he lived there but could not produce ID, classic burglar casing the place, probably waiting for the real owners to leave. Briggs, sitting in the passenger seat, looked physically ill. He kept stealing glances at Cedric in the mirror. There was something deeply unsettling about the man in the back seat. Criminals usually protested. They yelled. They cried. They threatened. They bargained. This man was entirely silent, sitting with posture so straight and composed, it felt as if he were the one in charge of the vehicle. Wade, Briggs whispered, leaning toward his partner. Did you even run the address? Did you call it in? I do not need to call it in. I caught him red-handed trespassing, Mercer dismissed, taking a sharp turn that sent Cedric sliding slightly across the plastic bench. Sergeant Voss is going to love this. We have had those package thefts on the east side. I bet you anything this is our guy. Cedric remained silent. He closed his eyes, already calculating his next moves. He needed to contact his inner circle. Specifically, he needed to reach Griffin Shaw, deputy director of the FBI. Cedric knew that if he revealed his identity too soon, Mercer might panic and try to cover his tracks, perhaps even escalating the situation out of fear. It was tactically safer to let the process unfold until he was inside a secure, recorded environment. The cruiser pulled into the gated rear lot of the local precinct. It was a sturdy, brutalist brick building that had stood for decades. Mercer parked the car, stepped out, and opened the rear door, grabbing Cedric roughly by the bicep. "Out!" Mercer barked. Cedric stepped into the bright air, finding his footing gracefully despite having his hands bound. He towered over Mercer, a physical fact that clearly irritated the younger officer. Mercer pushed Cedric toward the heavy steel doors of the precinct's rear entrance. The booking area was filled with low-level activity. A few officers typed at their desks, drank coffee, and complained about upcoming shift changes. Fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead. At the elevated booking desk sat Sergeant Lionel Voss, a red-faced veteran with a thick mustache and tired eyes. "Look what the cat dragged in," Mercer announced loudly, shoving Cedric toward the booking desk. "Caught him creeping around Elmwood Estates, refused to identify himself, trespassing, resisting, the works." Voss looked down from his perch, chewing slowly on a piece of gum. He studied Cedric's calm, impassive face, the gray sweatpants, and the Georgetown hoodie. "No ID?" Voss asked, his voice gravelly. "Claimed it was inside the house," Mercer sneered. "Claimed he owned the place. Multi-million-dollar estate, Sarge. Guy must think we are idiots." "Empty your pockets," Voss instructed, looking at Cedric. "My hands are cuffed behind my back, Sergeant," Cedric replied evenly. His voice cut through the background noise of the station. Several officers looked up from their keyboards. There was an undeniable cadence of command in Cedric's tone. Voss frowned, noticing the tight cuffs. "Mercer, take the bracelets off. Empty his pockets." Mercer hesitated, then begrudgingly unlocked the cuffs. Cedric brought his arms forward and rubbed his raw wrist deliberately, making sure the red welts were visible to the desk cameras. He reached into his sweatpants pockets and placed a single brass house key on the counter. "Nothing else. No wallet, no phone," Mercer said triumphantly. "See, who walks around with no phone?" "A man watering his own garden," Cedric stated clearly, looking directly into Voss's eyes. "Sergeant, your officer assaulted me on my own property. I am respectfully requesting my guaranteed phone call, and I suggest you preserve the dashcam footage from Officer Mercer's vehicle immediately." Voss stopped chewing his gum. A cold prickle of unease crawled up the back of his neck. The man standing before him was far too calm. He used phrases like "preserve dashcam footage" with the casual fluency of a seasoned prosecutor. Mercer scoffed loudly. "Listen to this guy. Thinks he's a lawyer now. Go ahead. Make your call. Call your public defender. Maybe they can explain how breaking and entering works." "Give him the phone, Wade," Voss ordered softly, his eyes never leaving Cedric. Mercer shoved a heavy desk phone across the counter. "Dial out." Cedric picked up the receiver with a steady hand. He did not need to look up a number. He had the direct line of the FBI deputy director memorized. He dialed smoothly. The phone rang only briefly before a sharp, alert voice answered. "Shaw." "Griffin," Cedric said calmly, turning his back slightly to the desk. "It is Cedric." There was a fraction of silence on the line before the deputy director's tone changed entirely. "Sir, you are on an unsecured line. Is everything all right?" "No, Griffin. I'm currently at the local police precinct in Bethesda. I have been arrested." "Excuse me? Arrested?" Shaw's voice dropped, tension radiating through the earpiece. "Are you injured?" "I am physically fine," Cedric said, his eyes scanning the precinct, taking in the faces of Mercer, Briggs, and Voss. "I was detained outside my home. Unlawful detention, excessive force. No Miranda warning. I need you to assemble the regional quick response team. Come to the Bethesda station. Bring legal counsel. Bring internal affairs. And Griffin?" "Yes, Director." "Bring everyone," Cedric said softly. He hung up and pushed the phone back across the desk. Then he looked at Mercer and offered a very small, utterly chilling smile. "He is on his way." The air inside the Bethesda precinct holding cell was stagnant, smelling of cheap bleach and years of human desperation. Officer Wade Mercer shoved Cedric into the small, concrete-walled enclosure without ceremony. The metal bars slammed shut with a harsh clang that echoed through the quiet station. Mercer turned the heavy key, locking the mechanism with a satisfied grunt. "Make yourself comfortable, pal," Mercer sneered, hooking his thumbs into his utility belt. Your buddy is going to need a lot of cash to bond you out of this one. Burglary tools, resisting arrest, trespassing, failure to identify. Cedric stood in the center of the cell, looking around the dismal space before turning his gaze back to the arrogant officer. He did not bother correcting the fabricated charge of burglary tools. He knew Mercer was desperately stacking charges to justify a bad arrest. "Officer Mercer," Cedric said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "Do you have a pension plan?" Mercer blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "A retirement account, a pension," Cedric clarified, taking a slow step toward the iron bars. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the corridor. "Because I highly recommend you begin considering private sector employment, though, given the federal indictments you will be facing, finding work with a felony conviction may prove exceedingly difficult." "Are you threatening a police officer?" Mercer demanded, his face flushing red, though a thin sliver of doubt finally began to eat at the edge of his ego. "I am stating a simple, inevitable fact," Cedric replied. Then he turned his back on Mercer and sat gracefully on the hard metal bench. He folded his hands in his lap and looked straight ahead, effectively dismissing the officer from his existence. Furious, Mercer spat a curse under his breath and stormed back to the main booking area. Out at the front desk, the atmosphere had changed drastically. Sergeant Voss was no longer chewing his gum. His face had lost all color, leaving his ruddy complexion a sickly gray. His eyes were glued to the glowing screen of his desktop computer, one hand trembling slightly on the mouse. When Cedric had demanded his phone call, Voss's instincts as a veteran had screamed that something was terribly wrong. As soon as Mercer had marched the prisoner to the back, Voss had pulled up the county property tax database and typed in the address Mercer provided. The screen populated almost instantly. Owner, Cedric L. Ashford. Status, paid in full. Assessed value, $6.2 million. Voss's breath hitched. Then he opened the National Criminal Database and typed in the name. The moment he hit search, the screen flashed a bright yellow warning banner. Restricted file. Clearance required. Contact Department of Justice secure line. A cold sweat broke across Voss's forehead. He minimized the police database, opened a standard web browser, and typed Cedric Ashford into the search bar. The first result was the government website. It was an official biography. There, staring back from the screen, was a high-resolution portrait of the man currently sitting in the holding cell. In the image, he wore a sharp navy suit and looked distinguished, powerful, and unmistakably authoritative. Beneath the portrait were the words that made Voss feel as if his heart had stopped. Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Sarge," Mercer called out, strutting back into the booking area. "Guy in the back is delusional, making threats about federal indictments. I am adding a terroristic threats charge to his sheet." Voss slowly looked up from his monitor. He looked at Mercer, then at Officer Nolan Briggs, who was quietly sipping coffee near the water cooler. "Wait," Voss whispered, his voice cracking violently. "Wait, what have you done?" "What do you mean?" Mercer asked, his arrogant smile faltering at the sight of his sergeant's absolute terror. "I got a bad guy off the streets, just doing my job." "You idiot," Voss breathed, standing up. His legs shook so badly he had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "You absolute catastrophic idiot, you did not arrest a burglar." Before Voss could explain, the machinery of the United States government was already moving with terrifying speed. Deputy Director Griffin Shaw slammed the phone down in his secure office and immediately hit a red speed dial button on his encrypted console. He did not call the local police chief. He did not call the mayor. He called Special Agent in Charge Rowan Keats, commander of the FBI's Washington field office. "Keats," Shaw barked the moment the line connected. "The director has been unlawfully detained by local police in Bethesda. The arresting officers used physical force and ignored his identity. I want a full tactical rollout. Now." "Sir, the director?" Keats's voice sharpened instantly, shifting into combat mode. "Mobilize the regional quick response force and the Washington field office SWAT element," Shaw ordered, already pulling a shoulder holster over his dress shirt. "I do not know the state of mind of these local officers, but they are armed, erratic, and they have Cedric in a cage. We are treating this as an active, hostile hostage situation under federal jurisdiction. I want the station locked down. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out until I have eyes on Cedric. We will bring the storm, Keats promised. Back at the precinct, the quiet day kept ticking forward. Voss frantically grabbed the phone, trying to call the chief of police, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial properly. Sarge, seriously, what is your problem? Mercer asked, stepping closer to the desk. You are acting like I shot the mayor. Worse, Wade. Worse, Voss croaked, finally turning the monitor around so Mercer could see the screen. Look at the screen. Look at his face. Mercer leaned in, squinting at the government webpage. He read the name. He read the title. The blood vanished from his face. His jaw went slack, and the coffee he had just poured slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. No, Mercer whispered, stumbling backward. No, that is impossible. He was wearing sweatpants. He did not look like what, Wade? Officer Briggs suddenly shouted, tossing his own cup into the trash as the horrifying implication of Mercer's profiling became undeniable. He did not look like he belonged in that neighborhood. I told you to leave him alone. I told you. We need to let him out. Mercer panicked, his bravado evaporating entirely. He lunged for his keys. I will just let him out. Apologize. Say it was a misunderstanding. It is too late for that, Voss said, staring blankly at the front doors of the precinct. A low, deep rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards of the station. It was not the high-pitched wail of police sirens. It was the heavy, synchronized roar of armored diesel engines. The rumble grew louder, shaking the framed commendations hanging on the precinct walls. Before Mercer or Voss could move toward the holding cells, the front windows of the Bethesda police station darkened as massive vehicles blocked out the sun. Officer Briggs rushed to the reinforced glass and gasped, "Oh, dear God." Outside, the quiet suburban street had been transformed into a militarized zone. Black unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans formed a barricade that boxed in the local police cruisers. Behind them, armored tactical vehicles idled aggressively, their heavy tires crushing the manicured curbs. Vehicle doors flew open simultaneously. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the street with terrifying, silent precision. They wore full tactical armor, Kevlar helmets, and olive drab windbreakers with FBI emblazoned across the front and back in bold yellow lettering. They carried short-barreled carbines at the low ready. Perimeter secured, roof access covered. A command voice thundered over a bullhorn. Through the windows, Briggs could see snipers taking positions on the roof of the dental clinic across the street, long-range rifles pointed directly toward the precinct doors. They are surrounding the building, Briggs stuttered, backing away from the window with his hands instinctively raised. Mercer, Voss ordered, his voice suddenly hard and desperate. Put your hands on the desk. Do not touch your weapon. If they think we are a threat, they will level this building. The heavy double glass doors of the precinct were violently yanked open. Tactical agents flooded into the lobby, fanning out with practiced lethal efficiency. They bypassed the metal detectors, immediately securing exits, hallways, and the armory door. Federal agents, keep your hands where we can see them. Nobody move. The lead SWAT operator bellowed, his rifle sweeping the room before locking onto Mercer. Hands away from your belt. Do it now. Mercer was hyperventilating. He raised his hands high above his head, trembling uncontrollably as agents rushed forward. They did not ask politely. They grabbed Mercer, spun him around, and stripped his duty belt, service weapon, and badge, tossing them onto the floor. Through the corridor of armed agents strode Deputy Director Griffin Shaw. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his eyes burned with absolute fury. Flanking him was Special Agent in Charge Rowan Keats, looking ready to dismantle the station brick by brick. Shaw marched directly to the booking desk and slammed his hand onto the elevated counter, making Voss jump out of his skin. I am Deputy Director Griffin Shaw of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced, his voice echoing through the dead-silent room. You are holding Director Cedric Ashford. If a single hair on his head has been harmed, I will personally see to it that everyone in this building is charged with federal kidnapping under Title 18. Where is he? He is in holding, Voss stammered, pointing a shaky finger down the hall. He is completely unharmed. It was a terrible mistake. Give me the keys, Keats interrupted, snatching the heavy keyring from Voss's trembling hand. Shaw and Keats, followed by a tight protective detail of SWAT operators, marched down the narrow cinder block hallway. They reached the cell. Cedric was still sitting on the metal bench, exactly as he had been left. His hands rested in his lap. His expression was completely tranquil. He looked up as the cavalry arrived. Keats quickly unlocked the door and slid the heavy metal bars open. "Director, are you injured?" "I'm fine, Rowan," Cedric said, standing smoothly. He smoothed the wrinkles from his faded Georgetown sweatshirt and looked at Shaw. "Thank you for the prompt response, Griffin." "Cedric, what happened?" Shaw asked, his fury softening into profound relief. "We did not know what we were walking into." "What you walked into," Cedric replied coolly, "is a textbook example of why our Civil Rights Division is currently backed up with systemic reform cases." He stepped out of the cell, and the federal agents parted respectfully to let him pass. "Let us go clear this up." Cedric walked back down the hallway and entered the main booking area. The room was frozen. Federal agents held the perimeter. Voss and Briggs stood behind the desk, pale and terrified. In the center of the room, surrounded by SWAT operators, stood Wade Mercer. Stripped of his weapon, his badge, and his unearned authority, he looked exactly like what he was. A frightened, arrogant bully who had finally picked a fight with a mountain. Cedric walked slowly toward him, his sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum. The director of the FBI stopped in front of the disgraced officer. Mercer could not look him in the eye. He stared at Cedric's chest, his breathing ragged. "Sir, Director, I did not know." "You did not know?" Cedric repeated, his voice smooth and devastatingly final. "That is the crux of the issue, Officer Mercer. You did not know. You did not know if I owned that home. You did not know my name. You did not bother to ask for verification, and you did not bother to investigate before using force." Cedric stepped closer, forcing Mercer to finally look up into his cold, unwavering eyes. "You looked at a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, and your prejudice made your decisions for you," Cedric said, his tone empty of anger but heavy with absolute judgment. "You thought you were above the law because you wore a badge, but let me make this abundantly clear." Cedric gestured to the heavily armed federal agents surrounding them, the armored vehicles outside, and the crushing weight of the United States government that had descended upon the local station. "You do not own the law," Cedric whispered, leaning in slightly. "We do. And as of this moment, your career in law enforcement is permanently over." Cedric turned to Shaw, his command absolute. "Griffin, call the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Have them send a federal investigative team down here. I want every arrest Officer Mercer has made in recent years audited. I want this entire precinct reviewed for civil rights violations." "Yes, Director," Shaw said, pulling his phone from his pocket. Cedric looked at Mercer one last time. "You thought you were making a major bust. You were right. You just busted yourself." Cedric turned on his heel and walked toward the glass doors, the sea of federal agents parting to let him out into the sunlight. Chief of Police Everett Sloan was at the Bethesda Country Club when his encrypted duty phone began vibrating violently. Sloan was a politician in uniform, a man who had spent years smoothing over minor scandals and keeping affluent taxpayers happy. He expected the call to be about a noise ordinance or a minor traffic collision involving a city councilman's teenager. Instead, it was the mayor screaming so loudly that Sloan had to pull the phone away from his ear. "Everett, get down to the precinct right now," Mayor Preston Halloway bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "Every news helicopter in the region is hovering over your station. The FBI just raided our police department. What in God's name is happening over there?" Sloan dropped his club onto the pristine grass. "Mr. Mayor, slow down. The FBI? Did they serve a warrant? Was there a task force I was not briefed on?" "They did not serve a warrant, Everett. They served the wrath of God. One of your idiot patrolmen arrested the director of the FBI in his own driveway, put him in cuffs, threw him in a cell. Get down there before the Department of Justice dissolves our entire city charter." Sloan drove toward the precinct with the siren of his unmarked cruiser wailing a frantic, desperate tune. As he turned onto the street leading to the station, his stomach dropped. The mayor had not exaggerated. The street was entirely barricaded by federal tactical vehicles. A perimeter of armed SWAT operators stood shoulder to shoulder, holding back a rapidly growing crowd of civilians and local news crews. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the unprecedented sight of a local American police station under federal siege. Sloan parked away from the perimeter and sprinted toward it, flashing his gold badge at the stone-faced federal agents. They barely parted to let him through, their eyes cold and unwelcoming. When Sloan pushed through the double glass doors of his own station, the silence inside was deafening. The federal tactical sweep had finished, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Deputy Director Shaw stood by the booking desk, speaking quietly into a satellite phone. Special Agent Keats leaned over the counter, glaring down at Sergeant Voss, who looked as though he might physically vomit. "Who's in charge here?" Keats barked as Sloan walked in, out of breath and sweating through his polo shirt. "I am," Sloan said, his voice trembling despite his best effort to sound authoritative. "Chief Everett Sloan." "Where's Director Ashford? I need to personally apologize." "The director has left the premises," Shaw interrupted, snapping his phone shut and turning to face the chief. "He has no interest in your apologies, Chief Sloan. He's interested in accountability, and as of this moment, your department is under a sweeping federal microscope." Sloan looked around the room. Sitting on a plastic chair in the corner, stripped of his duty belt, badge, and firearm, was Officer Wade Mercer. His head was buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Standing nearby, looking utterly defeated, was Officer Nolan Briggs. "What exactly happened?" Sloan demanded, staring directly at Voss. Voss could not even look his boss in the eye. Mercer grabbed a man outside a mansion on Elmwood, said he fit the profile of a burglar, ignored him when he said he lived there, cuffed him, brought him in. "We did not run the name until he was already in holding." "He was watering his flowers," Shaw added softly, his voice dripping with venom. "Your man assaulted the chief law enforcement officer of the United States government because he did not believe a black man could own a house in that zip code." Sloan felt his knees weaken. The liability, the lawsuits, the unimaginable public relations disaster. It was a career-ending meteor strike. He turned his fury toward Mercer. "Stand up!" Sloan roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Stand up, Mercer!" Mercer slowly got to his feet, tears streaming down his face. "Chief, I swear he was acting suspicious. He would not show me his ID. I was just following proactive patrol guidelines." "Shut your mouth!" Sloan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You are stripped of all police powers immediately. You are suspended without pay pending termination, and God help me if the union tries to fight this. I will personally burn this precinct to the ground." "The union will not be an issue," Shaw said coldly, stepping forward. He nodded to two towering FBI agents standing by the hallway. "Officer Wade Mercer, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for violations of Title 18, United States Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are also being charged with federal kidnapping and battery of a federal official." Mercer gasped, stumbling backward until he hit the concrete wall. No, wait, I'm a cop. You cannot do this." "You are not a cop anymore, Wade," Keats said, stepping forward with a pair of heavy federal handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The irony was thick, suffocating, and absolute. In the same room where Mercer had strutted proudly, boasting about his major arrest, he was now forcibly turned around. Federal agents locked steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. "Chief, please do something," Mercer begged, looking at Sloan. Sloan simply turned his back. "Process him," Keats ordered, "and put him in the same holding cell. I want him to sit on the exact same bench he forced the director to sit on." Mercer sobbed openly as agents marched him down the familiar cinder block hallway. The heavy metal bars screeched open and Mercer was shoved inside. The door slammed shut with deafening finality. The key turned. The lock engaged. Mercer collapsed onto the cold metal bench, burying his face in his cuffed hands as the reality of his shattered life finally crushed him under its immense weight. The Bethesda local precinct soon became utterly unrecognizable. The lobby was converted into a makeshift federal command center. Desks were pushed together, covered in laptops, secure servers, and mountains of printed case files. The Department of Justice dispatched a specialized civil rights investigative team led by Senior Agent Marin Vale. Vale was a methodical, terrifyingly brilliant investigator who specialized in dismantling corrupt police departments. She did not yell. She did not posture. She simply dug through paperwork until she found the rotting foundation. And in Bethesda, she did not have to dig deep. Cedric Ashford's directive had been clear. Audit every arrest Wade Mercer had made and review the supervisors who signed off on his reports. Agent Vale sat at the head of the precinct conference room table, a thick manila folder resting beneath her folded hands. Sitting across from her was Officer Nolan Briggs, looking older and hollowed out. He had voluntarily surrendered his badge and was cooperating fully, desperate to secure an immunity deal and protect his future. "Officer Briggs," Vale began, her voice crisp and professional, "we have been reviewing Officer Mercer's arrest records. It seems he had an extraordinarily high rate of confiscating cash during traffic stops and pedestrian checks." Briggs swallowed hard, looking toward the two-way mirror. Wade was aggressive. He targeted certain demographics. We all knew it. If a minority driver had a nice car in the wrong neighborhood, Wade would pull them over for failing to signal. He would claim he smelled marijuana to get probable cause for a search. And during those searches, Vale continued, opening the folder and sliding a photograph across the table, he frequently used civil asset forfeiture, claiming the cash he found was tied to illicit activity even when there was no drug conviction. Briggs nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." He would seize the money and tell people that if they fought it, he would hit them with felony distribution charges. Most just walked away, grateful they were not going to jail. Vale leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Here's where the math stops working, Officer Briggs. According to the property room logs, Mercer seized over $200,000 in cash, but our forensic accountants audited the precinct's forfeiture accounts. Only $40,000 was ever deposited." Briggs's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Wait, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Vale corrected sharply, "that Wade Mercer was not just a racist, overzealous cop. He was a thief. He used his badge to systematically extort innocent citizens, fabricate probable cause, steal their money, and pocket the difference. And Sergeant Voss was signing off on heavily redacted property reports. The twist hit the precinct like a secondary explosion. The bad arrest of the FBI director was not merely a catastrophic mistake. It had been an attempted robbery. Mercer had seen a black man at a multi-million-dollar estate and assumed he was either a criminal carrying illicit cash or a wealthy target who could be intimidated and shaken down. He had tried his usual extortion playbook on the worst possible target on the planet. Down in the federal detention center in Alexandria, Virginia, where Mercer had been transferred, the walls were closing in. Agent Vale walked into the bleak, windowless interview room carrying a fresh stack of indictments. Mercer wore a bright orange federal jumpsuit. His face was pale, with dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He looked completely broken. "Agent Vale," Mercer croaked, his voice raw, "my lawyer said we might be able to work out a plea for the civil rights charge. I will resign. I will never work in law enforcement again. I just want to avoid federal prison." Vale did not smile. She pulled out the chair and sat down, placing the thick stack of documents on the metal table. "Mr. Mercer, the civil rights charge regarding Director Ashford is the least of your problems right now." Mercer frowned, confusion washing over his exhausted face. "What do you mean?" "We audited your forfeiture logs," Vale stated, her voice as cold as ice. "We found the offshore accounts you opened in the Cayman Islands. We found the $75,000 hidden in the drywall of your garage. We have sworn statements from 14 victims who say you illegally detained and robbed them under threat of fabricated felony charges." Mercer stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so quickly Vale thought he might pass out. "You thought you were untouchable because you hid behind a badge?" Vale continued, leaning across the table to make sure he heard every word. "You targeted marginalized people because you believed they lacked the power to fight back. Then you got greedy. You got arrogant. You walked up a driveway in Elmwood Estates and tried to run your extortion game on Cedric Ashford." "I did not know," Mercer stammered, his mind short-circuiting as the magnitude of his crimes unfolded before him. "I know you did not," Vale said coldly, "and that is exactly why karma has caught up to you with such devastating precision." She tapped the stack of papers. "We are amending your charges, Mr. Mercer. You are no longer facing only a civil rights violation. We are charging you with 14 counts of extortion under color of official right, grand larceny, wire fraud, and federal racketeering." Mercer began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he gripped the edges of the metal table. "Racketeering? That is a RICO charge. That is for the mob. You operated a criminal enterprise using a police cruiser," Vale replied evenly, standing and gathering her folders. "The Department of Justice will not be offering you a plea deal. We are going to make a spectacular national example out of you." Vale walked to the heavy steel door and knocked twice for the guard. Then she looked back over her shoulder at the ruined man sobbing violently into his orange sleeves. "Director Ashford sends his regards," she said, quietly. He suggested I remind you to check your pension plan because where you are going, you will not be needing it. The heavy door slammed shut, echoing down the bleak corridor of the federal prison. Wade Mercer was finally left alone in the dark, entirely consumed by the monstrous consequences of his own arrogance. The media circus surrounding the United States District Court in downtown Washington, D.C., became unlike anything the city had seen in years. News vans lined the streets for blocks, and reporters camped on the courthouse steps, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had spectacularly dismantled his own life. The trial of former officer Wade Mercer became a national spectacle, a glaring spotlight on the abuse of power and the swift, unforgiving hammer of federal justice. Inside the grand, oak-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Wade Mercer sat at the defense table, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had once strutted up a Bethesda driveway. He was drowning in an ill-fitting gray suit, his face gaunt, his eyes darting nervously around the gallery. Beside him, his weary public defender shuffled papers, knowing there was no strategy that could save his client from the mountain of evidence the federal government had compiled. Lead prosecutor Celeste Ward stood before the jury box, her voice ringing with clear, undeniable authority. She had methodically paraded Mercer's past victims before the court. 14 citizens, including teachers, nurses, and construction workers, bravely took the stand. They told chillingly similar stories of being pulled over, intimidated, threatened with fabricated drug charges, and robbed of their hard-earned cash by the man sworn to protect them. But the final nail in the coffin came when the prosecution called its star witness. A heavy silence fell over the gallery as Cedric Ashford walked through the polished wooden doors. He wore a pristine charcoal suit, his posture immaculate, radiating the quiet, absolute power of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not look at Mercer as he walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. When Cedric sat down, Prosecutor Ward approached the podium. "Director Ashford, could you please recount the events at your residence in Elmwood Estates?" Cedric spoke with clinical, devastating precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply laid out the unvarnished facts. He described the lack of probable cause, the immediate resort to physical force, the refusal to verify identity, and the racial profiling that drove the entire encounter. "Did the defendant ever ask for your name before placing you in handcuffs, Director?" Ward asked. "He did not," Cedric replied, his deep baritone echoing through the silent room. "He operated entirely on an assumption based on my race and my casual attire in an affluent neighborhood. He bypassed every procedural safeguard designed to protect the constitutional rights of the public." Mercer stared at the table, his face burning red, tears of shame and terror pooling in his eyes. "And when you arrived at the precinct, did anyone attempt to rectify the situation?" Ward pressed. Cedric's gaze slowly shifted toward the gallery, where former Sergeant Lionel Voss sat. Voss had accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Mercer in exchange for a reduced sentence for accessory to extortion. "The environment at the precinct was one of absolute complicity," Cedric stated firmly. "The defendant operated with impunity because the system around him allowed it. It was a culture of arrogance that believed the badge was a shield against consequences. They were fundamentally incorrect. The defense did not even attempt to cross-examine the director. To question Cedric Ashford on federal law or police procedure would have been procedural suicide. The jury returned a verdict swiftly. When the foreperson stood to read it, Mercer gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On 14 counts of extortion under color of official right, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of federal racketeering, we find the defendant guilty." The words struck Mercer like physical blows. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands as quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom gallery. Judge Alistair Green, a stern man with zero tolerance for police corruption, looked down from the bench, his expression entirely unsympathetic. "Mr. Mercer," Judge Green boomed, his voice dripping with disgust, "you were entrusted with the authority of the state. You were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you used those tools to operate a criminal enterprise. You preyed upon the very citizens you swore to defend. Your actions are a cancer upon the honorable profession of law enforcement. The judge picked up his gavel. You targeted the director of the FBI through sheer prejudiced arrogance, and in doing so, you finally brought the light of justice to your dark extortion scheme. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Marshals moved in immediately, pulling a sobbing Wade Mercer to his feet and snapping heavy chains around his wrists and waist. As he was dragged toward the side door, Mercer looked over his shoulder one last time. Cedric Ashford stood quietly in the front row, his face completely impassive, watching the machinery of justice swallow the corrupt officer whole. Eventually, quiet returned to Bethesda, Maryland. The air was crisp, the sun rising over the manicured lawns of Elmwood Estates. Cedric Ashford stood at the end of his long paved driveway, wearing his faded Georgetown sweatshirt and old sneakers. He held the green garden hose, letting water soak the soil around his prize-winning hydrangeas. The neighborhood was calm, safe, and genuinely peaceful. A new local police cruiser drove slowly down the street and pulled to a stop near the curb. Behind the wheel was a young, diverse officer from the newly reformed precinct. The officer rolled down the window and offered a respectful, professional wave. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," the officer called warmly. "Beautiful day for the garden." Cedric smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression of peace. "Good morning, officer. It certainly is. Keep up the good work out there." The cruiser rolled away, leaving Cedric to the quiet comfort of his home. The system was broken in many places, but Cedric knew with absolute certainty that piece by piece it could be repaired. The storm had passed. The bad apples had been uprooted. Karma had not merely spoken, it had cleared the field. Wade Mercer thought a badge made him invincible, but he learned the hard way that true power lies in accountability and justice. He went fishing for an easy target and reeled in a federal prison sentence, losing everything he had. That is what happens when arrogance meets the immovable force of absolute karma. If you felt the satisfaction of seeing a corrupt bully finally face the music, smash that like button, share this epic story of justice served, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life revenge and karma stories.